Good evening. Greetings and felicitations.
Hip, hip, hurrah, tally-ho.
Hello, my little Georgia Peach. Your neck looks so beautiful.
Hey, Puddin'.
Did I scare you with my Dracula impersonation?
Well, that's kind of become something people make fun of now.
Yeah, and so when we think of Dracula, we think of Bela Lugosi's version of Dracula.
And very menacing back then.
So let's talk about the details. Directed by Todd Browning and Carl Freund, produced by Todd Browning and Carl Laemmle Jr., based on the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker and the play by Hamilton Dean and John L. Balderston, starring Bela Lugosi, David Manners, Helen Chandler, Dwight Fry, and Edward Von Sloan. Distributed by Universal Pictures. The release date in New York was February 12, 1931. It ran 75 minutes long. The budget was $341,000. All right, this movie, I think in so many ways, especially the stills. I remember looking at these pictures in Famous Monsters of Filmland before I even saw the movie. I think there's so many beautiful scenes in this movie.
They did try to make it very grandiose, kind of like Phantom of the Opera.
Totally. And it's interesting to note that if you read the original Bram Stoker book, the movie is very different. Even the depiction of Dracula is so different. In the book, he's an old man with gray hair. The fangs are more prominent. Whereas the movie, just Bela Lugosi has more style. And I'd say more sex appeal even. Because he was directed only to bite the necks of women going into the movies. Believe it or not, and we're talking the 1930s, it was said that if he were to bite the necks of men, it would have homosexual undertones.
So that's what they were thinking back then. But it does explain how Dracula later became more of a romantic figure.
Oh, totally. Now, the idea was early on that they wanted to make the movie in line more with the Bram Stoker book, but there already was a stage play going on, and this was in the height of the Depression. So the studio said, instead of making something that we have to retool everything in order to make the version of the book, let's just take the stage play and transform it into a motion picture. So it was for budgetary restraints that we had this new version of Dracula. And you look at the clothing of Dracula, it's become iconic in itself. The tuxedo, the cape. Bela Lugosi, he wasn't buried in one of his original capes, but he was buried in a Dracula cape. And that was because his children wanted that.
They wanted that for this iconic character that he played. That's what they wanted him remembered for, which he was.
Now, in 1931, there also was another version of Dracula that was released. It is the Spanish language version. Watching them back to back, I have to honestly say the cinematography behind the Spanish one is much superior than the American one. I love Bela Lugosi's character. I love his appearances. But when you get to see how different directors will film something very similar but have a different vision of it, I have to give credit to the Spanish version.
They were both being made at the same time, which is interesting. So, and yeah, even watching the later versions, you can see how it's so different and how the character is changed, and different directors have different views of Dracula.
And another thing that was interesting, and it's kind of difficult for us in the modern audiences to watch this, but it's wonderful to see it for its historical context, is that there's no soundtrack to it. There's points in the movie where there's totally dead, empty space, because it was viewed at the time of, well, if there's music in the movie, but there's no need for music, it might confuse the audiences where the music is coming from. Like, I can't even imagine that mentality now, because scenery music, background music is integral to all movies. And even just a short time later, we would see that mentality would change.
Yeah, it's like they were still trying to figure out how to make movies back then.
Which they were. But let's talk about trying to figure out how to make movies. The scene with Dracula's castle and the coach traveling along the road in front of it, that scene was actually a painting of a castle on glass. I mean, it was beautiful.
It's amazing the way they could make sets and have it look real.
During that time period, we're looking at 90 years ago. It's unreal that they had that much creativity at that time. I mean, this movie industry was new, but it was driving forward at fast pace. And I love even just the little nuances that were added, such as Bela Lugosi never blinking his eyes. I mean, this was willful to make him seem more undead. It's one of those things that you don't notice it until you look for it, and then you say, wow, that's pretty amazing. And also the fact that when Dracula's hypnotic stare, when he was doing that, cinematographer Carl Freund achieved this effect by aiming 2 pencil spot lights on Bela Lugosi's eyes. It's all these little nuances that really make this special, and there were effects that would be used and improved upon years later.
It's such a different way to do it. I mean, something we wouldn't think of, but it was very effective. And of course, you have to remember it was black and white. But even then, yeah, you can imagine someone staring at you, and it would still be very scary.
All right, we have to laugh at some of the scenes in here. Like, one particularly is when we look into Dracula's castle. When we think of modern-day rodents, we think of mainly spiders or cockroaches, even rats. In Dracula's castle, they had armadillos running around.
Yeah, it's very strange.
Well, the idea was armadillos like to burrow in the ground, and the thought to some at that time was that the armadillos would be burrowing into graves to eat carcasses.
So they were in the castle because there were carcasses there?
That was the mentality behind it. Hey, let's talk about censorship during this time.
So this was during the pre-code era, which is something they had in Hollywood, where they were trying to censor some things, such as sexual innuendo or things between black and white people, mild profanity, illegal drug use, promiscuity, infidelity. Those things were not supposed to be shown as much back then, and well, it wasn't really enforced until 1934, so it wasn't enforced as much in this movie.
But we did see there was some respect to that, because in this movie, we don't see any pierce marks on the neck of any victims. It's implied, but later on in movies, it would be shown very vividly.
Well, another thing that you don't think of today.
Yeah, that was considered too violent.
It's something we associate with Dracula now.
And something that was curious is that Bette Davis was considered to play the part of Mina Harker, but Universal at that time didn't think too highly of her sex appeal. Do you think that more attention would be paid to this film of general audiences if Bette Davis was in it? Do you think that she would be a pro for the movie or a con for the movie?
That is an interesting thought, because she was famous, but I think she was probably not as beautiful as the woman they did use. I think the biggest draw for the movie really was Dracula himself and Lugosi.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And it's been rumored that Bela Lugosi couldn't speak English well, and he had to be taught phonetically to speak English, and that has been disproved for years. But his accent, I mean, think about it. This has become, just the way he speaks, has become synonymous with this character for decades now. Universal, they're not realizing it, but they're setting the pace. They're building a framework for their own unique versions of literary characters that would go on almost a century later as being the absolute standard, even though it does veer away from the source material.
Having the accent in the movie was very effective, and it fits where Dracula was supposed to be from, Transylvania. So all of that worked. And Lugosi had played Dracula in a stage play before this movie.
That's right. And that's why the transition was so easy when they filmed this. Not only was the production values there, the story there, but also the actor was familiar with the material. I mean, it's a stroke of genius. And we could think that we could actually be thankful that if it wasn't for budgetary reasons, this Dracula film would be very different. And going forward, our view of Dracula would be very different. I actually don't think the book version would be as iconic as a character without Bela Lugosi's interpretation that he used from the stage play.
Yeah, it could have been very different.
And think about it, Lon Chaney, who we remember from The Phantom of the Opera, he was considered to take the role of Dracula. I'm actually glad that Bela Lugosi took this part as opposed to Lon Chaney.
I think Lugosi was perfect for the part, really. He had that look that was just right. I mean, because now it's just what we think of as Dracula.
All right, so in overview of this film, I have to say, watching it, when I was younger, I was more intrigued by it. As an adult, there are a ton of flaws with it. And comparing it to the Spanish version, I like the Spanish version much, much more. I am going to just barely give it a thumbs up because of the classic stills and because of Bela Lugosi's performance. But the pacing of it, the view of it, many times it was a hard watch. What do you think?
Yeah, I have to agree, even though I liked it and I say it's worth watching, but it's not as memorable as some of the other classic movies. What you take away from this one is just the idea of Dracula himself and the parts of it that will be used later in Dracula movies and other incarnations. So I'll say thumbs up, but it's not one of the best movies.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Please continue to follow and interact with us on both Facebook and Twitter.
If you use Apple IIe, Commodore 64, or Tandy computers, find us on your bulletin board system. Your 5-star feedback is always welcome.
Theme music provided by Checkpoint Charley.
Until next time, live long and may the Force be with you.
Nanu Nanu.